Okay, before we get into looking at what each one of the various meters does and how best to use it, I want to have a brief conversation about metering in general. Now, if you go back to the beginning of our industry, for the longest time, this was the only meter that we had available to us. It was the humble volume unit or VU meter. And this thing has two big advantages that no one appreciated at the time. The first is, because it used a mechanical needle, there was an inherent lag, and just by the nature of its design, this would show you average levels rather than peak levels. And so you tended to mix to a more average loudness and stayed away from maximizing peak loudness. Now, eventually they added the red LED peak light that was triggered at either +3 or +6 so that you could see if the channel was overloading. But the very nature of this meter's response tended to drive the engineer to a more average perspective on loudness control. The second thing that this meter had going for it versus today is it's pretty boring. And so there wasn't a whole lot of visual information to be gained, and consequently you spent a lot less time looking at the meters and a lot more time simply listening to the program material. Now, after the shift to digital and the current generation of stuff, we have every possible kind of meter and display available to us, and that's great, and it gives us a tremendous amount of data, but especially in the creative side of the house. So when you're working upstream of WaveLab in something like Sonar or Cubase or what have you, I've told people for years that it's really important to disregard the meters from time to time, or just simply close your eyes and use your ears, because otherwise you'll end up, or can end up, mixing based on what you're seeing more than what you're hearing. And at the end of the day, especially in the musical environment, what you're hearing is the ultimate litmus test of whether it's working or not. So there is a downside to all of this eye candy, and that is that it can draw your focus away from the sound of what you're working on. Now, having said that, let's take just a minute and go through what the metering tools in WaveLab are, because the nature of the work that we do in WaveLab tends to be much more analytical and a lot more scientific than you would see in, say, Cubase. Okay, if we look at the meters menu, you can see all of the various meters available in WaveLab. And of course, you can take these and park them in different configurations and various control windows and tool windows and park them around on other monitors. They don't need to surround your workspace, depending on what your monitor setup is. And of these, most are very self-explanatory, and we'll blow through those really quickly so that we can spend a little more time on the advanced ones. So I've got just a loop of this tune going down here, and I've turned down the monitor so we can let it play visually and play in the background, and we can talk about what the meters are doing while it's doing its thing. The first and probably most straightforward of all the meters is the timecode window up here, and you'd think there's nothing to say about that, except it does have some interesting configuration options. For one, you can set up your colors and that sort of thing, as you often do. But probably the two most interesting aspects are the play forward or countdown mode. You can click this second icon, and it'll display the seconds remaining in the current selection rather than the time since the cursor began. And then these other tools over here just allow you to set what it's counting up from or counting down to. And that's handy. Most other counters I've dealt with don't give you that level of flexibility. So we'll put this back in the sort of the normal mode. If we move over here to the wave scope, this is exactly what its name implies. I'm going to stop this and start over because it zeroes itself out each time you do that. And you'll see it's just going to simply build the wave display that's playing down below to see what that looks like. Or maybe you have chosen to use each of these in a different mode, that sort of thing. It's not providing you any additional information beyond what you have in the normal waveform display. You can, like with all these meters, you can rotate them around and you can do different color selections and resolution choices and things of that nature. But we'll go back to the normal. And right behind it, the oscilloscope is also, it's showing you level information, but as opposed to something panning left to right, it's showing you what's happening at the cursor at the moment. And again here, if we stop this, come to the Analyze tool and select our mode to Edit Cursor. Wherever I put the cursor, you're going to see the meters respond to that specific area. And put it back to playback and keep rolling here. So the oscilloscope is it's really just another way to view amplitude at a specific period in time. Then if we come over to this other window, Let me go back to the wave scope there because it's not quite so intrusive. If we look at the spectrum meter, and I'll trash the freeze frame on there. This is also showing, frequency, amplitude, and time. And you can see that going from 20 hertz on the left to north of 20,000. There is a momentary peak hold above each. And this is essentially giving you the same kind of information that you see in the, in a graphic EQ display, except it has a much higher level of granularity. And of course, you're going to use that sort of a display to zero in on which frequency ranges are more prominent. So if you're hearing a tone that's really resonating in a piece of music or maybe a guitar recording, and you're trying to make a decision about what equalization to apply to level that out or to moderate it, a spectrometer can be very helpful with that. Spectroscope is essentially the same thing, a little less granularity, and again, it's holding peaks at the top, but it's the sort of thing you're going to look at when you're making generally equalization or dynamic curve decisions about the frequency distribution across a piece of music. So those are all very straightforward. Less intuitive is the level meter, loudness meter, and phase scope. And we'll start with the level meter first. And this is, in fact, let me see if I can, we'll try to set the surrounding stuff to a little less distracting display. What you're seeing in this level meter, you have level at the top and then pan at the bottom. And the outer two are showing you instantaneous or peak level response. And it's giving you the highest recent peak in the numerically by the hold level that's dancing around. And then to the far right-hand side, you're going to see the loudest peak so far in that track. And the outer two bars are left and right channel instantaneous. The inner two are a digital representation of that VU meter that we saw. And there are functions here where you can go in and adjust the settings of that so that the ballistics on the VU meter here are going to be whatever you choose to set them to. You can see you've got a resolution and range inertia there. And you can set them for whichever needle model you'd like it to represent. But if you just watch that for a moment, you can see how the older VU meter was showing you a level that was considerably lower than, an average RMS level that was considerably lower than what was going on in terms of peak amplitude at the time. And a lot of people have speculated that the shift from analog to digital had a lot to do with the beginning of what we call the loudness wars, with everybody pushing higher and hotter and faster on the mixes, partially just because you could. As soon as you could see that there was more headroom available, there was a natural tendency to try and push in to use all of that. But that's essentially what you're seeing there side by side is modern digital on the outer pair, more traditional VU style on the inner with the maximums at the far right-hand side. Then down below that, you have a pan energy window. And the top display, again, is instantaneous. You can just tell by the refresh rate that that's a much more rapidly updated display. And it's showing you left or right balance moment to moment. The display below it is average energy left to right. And again, if we come back over here and if we stop playback and we select Edit Cursor, calm everything down for a second, you can click into any point. Now, when you're in this mode, you notice that the maximums are dropped off the far right-hand side. The numeric maximums for the playback period drop away. But you can see the recent peaks by each one of the bars there. And so you're seeing in the pan down below there, the pan display is giving you instant and average overall spectrum distribution there. Now, speaking of loudness, let's move to the loudness tab itself, and I'm going to start playback again here. And the loudness, I need to reset the response to the playback mode. There we go. So let me get this going, and then I'm going to use the freeze meters tool for just a second. Okay. Loudness is as opposed to absolute volume or peak, loudness is a term that refers to the average amplitude or the perceived volume of a piece of program material. And there's a standard R128. It's mandatory for broadcasters in Europe. It's recommended for broadcasters in the U.S. And in a nutshell, if you've ever experienced the situation where you're watching a movie on television and they cut to a commercial, and suddenly the volume blasts you out of the seat. The R128 standard is an attempt to do away with that phenomena. And our loudness control to date has largely been our thumbs, right, on the remote control. So when the commercial comes in at an insanely loud volume, you can drive it back down. And that has a lot to do with the commercial being mixed relative to what is the maximum peak volume I can possibly squeeze out of this versus a more relaxed approach to audio management during the program material itself. And they use a slightly different vocabulary in the loudness world. You're using LU, or loudness units, instead of VU, or volume units. The standard is the same. Your target is, you're kind of shooting for this 0 mark here, your optimum mark, although that's technically minus 23 LU. But this all has to do with averages over time. So you've got 3 bars at the bottom there, which say I, S, and M. The bottommost is your momentary loudness, so that's a real-time, kind of an instantaneous readout. The one above it is short-term, and that looks back a couple of seconds. And then the top bar is that says I is integrated, and that's an average over the life of the piece of music. And you can see that this is, then the amber bar above is showing you where the majority of the songs or the program material's loudness hangs out. So in the case of what we're looking at here, it's saying that the majority of the program material is coming in at +9. The second most common occurrence is here around, what I suppose that's +7.5, +8. And then it slopes down dramatically on either side. And again, you have the instant reading and the average reading here numerically off to the side. And the purple bar is telling you that's the ideal range. And again, you can come to your functions and settings, and you can tweak all of this so that not only are the colors right, but you can come in here, right, the colors are whatever you want them to be, but you can come in and set your target loudness and an acceptable deviation to whatever value you or your client or your application demands. So that it's got the standard R128 values in here, which is a target of -23 LU full scale, and an acceptable deviation either side of 2. And for a piece of pop music like this, or whatever you want to call this music, it's normal to have your loudness volume, loudness levels above that optimized zone. That purple area is really primarily intended for broadcast applications. So if we were doing a mix where we had Foley, dialogue, and music all together, we would want these orange peaks to hang out inside that purple area most of the time. Now let me play just a little more and freeze this again. Let me unfreeze this and show you one other aspect of this. Okay. And you may have noticed that after I started playback, it took a moment or two for the short-term bar to pop up and then longer for the integrated bar to pop up. And that's because, again, we're dealing with averages. So it has to sample what's going on for a while before it can make those calculations. You'll notice the heavy red boxes around the end of those bar graphs, and that's showing you the dynamic range. So in this bottom one, the momentary one, which I think looks back like 4 milliseconds, the dynamic range has been as high as this and as low as that. And it gives you some sense of how much compression room you still have, or how much headroom you still have, or how much you've used up. And ideally, you would want, in broadcast material, you would want those rectangles to be a lot longer than these are. And same for up above. You can see the dynamic range of the overall piece, the integrated, is almost nothing. It's way too loud for the intended targets here. So the other aspect of the loudness standard to keep in mind there is that you have this function. You'll see the purple light that says gate, and again, this is easier to demonstrate in a broadcast application if we had a soundtrack in here. But the other problem with using this integrated loudness over the life of the entire piece of music or the entire program material is that if you have long periods of silence, say in a movie where there's a long romantic pause in the dialogue, all of that zero signal would get factored in, and it would pull your integrated loudness way, way down. And what that would result in is potentially having the car chase, or when the door slams or whatever, be much louder than it should be, and still it would trick out the system. Your average would be a lot lower in numeric terms than it really is in aesthetic terms. And so what this gate function does, and again, you can go into your functions here and make all your gate settings and adjustments. What it's doing, anything below your gate threshold is ignored. And the idea there is if you had, say, a 2-minute scene in which a minute and a half was dead silence because, I don't know, the main character is just scanning the horizon or whatever, it would ignore all of that dead silence and just average sort of the active audio in the component or in the piece. And the threshold is set by that gate value there. So that's essentially how you would use this. And again, in the United States, and I'm assuming the majority of our viewers are probably in North America, the U.S., Canada, and so forth. The R128 standard is a suggestion, not a requirement. But if you do end up producing material for Western Europe, the R128 standard in the broadcast environment is a requirement that they've got to comply with. And you can use this tool set to make sure that the stuff you're sending is already in the ballpark, and it's going to prevent the folks on the other end from having to do too much more to it. And okay, so the last meter here that we want to jump over to is what's often one of the most confusing, which is the phase scope. And so before we look at this in detail, let's take a couple of minutes and just review the concepts of phase cancellation, phase correlation, and then we'll come back and look at how to use this to make sure we're doing everything just right.